Welcome to English with Miss Julia. This lesson is aimed at intermediate and advanced learners. We will be reading a story with the title Cycling Through the Spanish Countryside. I encourage you to stop the video regularly. Reread the text in paragraph form. Make a note of the vocabulary. Practice the pronunciation and be sure to understand the grammar used. That being said, let's get started. Pablo gripped the handlebars of his weathered bicycle, the cool morning air brushing his face as he pedaled along the winding roads of the Spanish countryside. The scent of olive trees filled the air, and the distant call of a sparrow echoed through the valley. His eyes scanned the horizon, where rolling hills met the sky, and a sense of freedom surged through him with each turn of the pedals. "How far do you think we'll go today, old friend?" Pablo murmured to his bike, the loyal companion that had carried him across endless stretches of land. From behind, a voice called out, "Not too far, I hope. You know I'm not built for these long rides like you, Pablo." Pablo glanced back and smiled. It was Esteban, his childhood friend, struggling to keep pace. His old red scarf flapped wildly behind him, barely keeping up. "Don't worry, Esteban," Pablo chuckled. "We'll find a place to rest soon enough. But look at this, isn't it beautiful?" Esteban puffed out his breath, glancing at the fields that stretched endlessly on either side of them. "Beautiful, sure, but I'd call it endless." The sun climbed higher as they rode, painting the landscape in golden hues. Pablo's heart swelled at the sight of Spain in all its untouched glory. The wild flowers, the winding dirt paths, the ancient stone walls that had stood witness to so many stories. His mind began to wander. "Remember when we used to race through the village streets as kids?" Pablo asked, a grin stretching across his face. Esteban laughed, though it came with effort now, his breath ragged. "Race? You mean you'd race and I'd try not to crash into a donkey cart?" Pablo laughed aloud at the memory. "You always had a knack for the dramatic." Suddenly a strange figure appeared on the road ahead, a woman draped in a shawl, standing as still as a statue by the edge of the olive grove. Her eyes followed them, but her expression remained unreadable. Pablo slowed his pace, feeling a strange pull toward her. "Who do you think she is?" Esteban asked, his voice quieter now, a hint of unease creeping in. "I don't know," Pablo replied, his grip tightening on the handlebars, "but something tells me we should keep going." The woman's eyes never left them, even as they pedaled past her. A chill ran down Pablo's spine, even though the sun was warm above. As they rounded the bend, the woman disappeared from their view, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves in her wake. "That was odd," Esteban muttered, glancing back over his shoulder. Pablo nodded, his mind racing. Who stands like that in the middle of nowhere? A silence settled between them, one that wasn't entirely comfortable. Pablo's thoughts drifted. What if she was a sign of something to come? The landscape around them had felt so peaceful just moments before, but now it seemed different. The shadows were longer, the wind had shifted. Do you think she'll be there when we come back? Esteban asked, almost as if he feared the answer. I don't know, Pablo admitted, but I think we'll find out soon enough. Pablo shook off the uneasy feeling that clung to him like the dust from the road. They pressed on, the rhythmic crunch of their tires on the dirt paths the only sound filling the air now. The once bright, carefree morning seemed to have dimmed as if the sky had become quieter. You ever get the feeling someone's watching you? Esteban's voice cut through the stillness. Pablo glanced over at him, and though he tried to play it off with a smirk, he couldn't shake the same sensation. Maybe it's just the wind, or the sheep. He pointed toward a distant flock lazily grazing in a field to their left. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it himself. Esteban wasn't convinced either. That woman, she didn't just appear out of nowhere. There's no house for miles. What do you think she was doing? Pablo didn't have an answer, but his mind kept circling back to the woman's eyes, so dark and still. I don't know, he said finally, but we'll keep moving. Spain's a big place, and we've got many roads ahead. The landscape shifted again as they cycled deeper into the countryside. The olive trees gave way to vineyards, their twisting rows stretching across the rolling hills like endless green waves. In the distance, a stone farmhouse appeared, tucked neatly into the hillside, its terracotta roof gleaming in the sun. Let's stop there for water, Pablo suggested, and Esteban nodded, visibly relieved. The front door creaked open as they approached the farmhouse, and an elderly man stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes narrowed as they drew near, as if he hadn't seen strangers in quite some time. Buenos dias, Pablo called out, raising his hand in greeting. We've been cycling all morning. Could we trouble you for some water? The old man studied them for a long moment before nodding slowly. Come in then. The well's out the back. Pablo dismounted, the earth crunching beneath his feet as he stretched his legs. Esteban followed suit, muttering something about needing more than just water to recover from the ride. As they walked toward the well, the old man spoke, his voice gravely with age. Not many people pass through these parts anymore, especially on bikes. His eyes flickered over them. You boys sure you know where you're headed? Pablo frowned, unsure of the meaning behind the man's words. We're just exploring, taking in the countryside. The old man chuckled, a sound that seemed out of place in the stillness of the farm. Exploring, eh? Just be careful. The countryside's a funny thing. It's not always what it seems. Esteban glanced at Pablo, his brow furrowed. What do you mean by that? He asked, not entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. The man shrugged, leaning on the well. There's old roads out there, forgotten places. People wander through them without realizing, and sometimes they don't come back the same. Pablo exchanged a glance with Esteban. Have you ever seen a woman in a shawl around here? She was standing on the road just before we arrived. The old man's eyes darkened, his face unreadable. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly drew water from the well, the creak of the pulley filling the silence. Maybe I have, he said, finally, handing them the bucket. Or maybe you did. You best be on your way now. Pablo exchanged a weary glance with Esteban as they took the bucket from the old man. The man's cryptic words clung to the air like the distant hum of bees in the summer heat, unsettling them both. Gracias, Pablo said quietly, and they each took a long drink from the cool, clear water. It refreshed their throats, but did little to clear the strange feeling that had settled over them like a fog. Esteban looked back at the old man, who had turned his gaze towards the hills, watching something they couldn't see. What do you think he meant by that? Esteban whispered, his voice low. About people not coming back the same. Pablo shook his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. Maybe he's just a superstitious old man, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he didn't quite believe them. Let's get back on the road before we lose the daylight. The two mounted their bikes again, the wheels crunching over the gravel as they turned back onto the path. The farmhouse slowly disappeared behind them, swallowed up by the landscape. But even as they pedaled farther away, the old man's warnings seemed to follow them. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the vineyards. In the distance, a narrow path branched off from the main road, winding up into the hills. Pablo slowed, his gaze drawn to the path. It was overgrown as if it hadn't been used in years, and something about it tugged at his curiosity. Why are you stopping? Esteban asked, pulling up beside him, breathing heavily from the climb. Pablo nodded toward the hidden path. Look at that. I bet it leads somewhere interesting. Esteban frowned. Oh, no way. Why do you always have to find the most difficult routes? Pablo smiled, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Because that's where the best stories are, Esteban. Don't you ever wonder where these old roads go? Esteban sighed. You're going to get us lost, aren't you? Probably, Pablo laughed. But what's life without a little adventure? Against his better judgment, Esteban followed as Pablo turned onto the overgrown trail. The trees closed in around them, casting doubled shadows on the path as the light grew dimmer. The air was cooler here, filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. They rode in silence for a long while, the only sound being the soft crunch of their tires on the dirt and the occasional call of a bird overhead. But as they rounded a bend, something caught their attention. Ahead of them, standing in the middle of the path, was the same woman in the shawl. She stood perfectly still, just as before, her eyes locked on them. Pablo felt his heart race as he pulled his bike to a stop. "It's her," he whispered. How did she get here before us?" Esteban's voice was barely audible. "Pablo, we should turn around." But Pablo, ever curious, stepped off his bike and took a few steps forward. "Hola," he called out softly, raising his hand in greeting. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" The woman didn't answer. She simply stared, her dark eyes unblinking, as if she were waiting for something. The silence between them stretched until it felt unbearable. Just as Pablo opened his mouth to speak again, the woman slowly raised her hand and pointed, not at them, but at something behind them. Pablo turned, and his breath caught in his throat. In the distance, just beyond the trees, stood a stone tower, partially hidden by the thick foliage. It looked ancient, forgotten, like something out of a legend. "How did we not see that before?" Esteban asked, his voice shaking. Pablo couldn't tear his eyes away from the tower. I don't know, but I think we need to see it up close." Pablo's curiosity burned like a fire he couldn't control. His gaze fixed on the tower, its ancient stone surface covered in ivy and moss, a relic of some forgotten time. Without thinking, he pushed his bike forward. "Are you serious?" Esteban's voice trembled, but he followed, his eyes darting nervously between Pablo and the woman in the shawl, who still stood frozen, watching them. Pablo nodded, his voice firm. "We've come this far. We have to see it." Esteban muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. They pushed their bikes up the narrow trail, which became steeper as they approached the tower. The trees grew denser, and the air seemed to grow heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As they neared the base of the tower, Pablo felt an odd sensation. The ground beneath their feet felt different, softer, almost like it wasn't entirely solid. He stopped and knelt, brushing away the dirt with his hand. What he uncovered sent a shiver through him. "It's cobblestone," Pablo whispered, tracing his fingers along the ancient stones. "This used to be a road." Esteban leaned over, wide-eyed. "How old do you think this is?" Pablo stood, glancing up at the tower. Centuries at least. Maybe it was part of a village. There could be more ruins nearby. More ruins? That's what you're thinking about right now? Esteban shook his head. What about her? He glanced back down the trail where the woman in the shawl had been standing. But now she was gone. The path behind them was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Pablo's heart skipped a beat. Where did she go? Esteban stepped back, his voice rising in panic. I told you we shouldn't have turned around. She's playing with us, Pablo. This is not normal. But Pablo couldn't turn back now. Something about the tower drew him in. There's something here, Esteban, something important. He took a deep breath and approached the tower's base, where a heavy wooden door stood, slightly ajar. He hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open, the wood creaking under the pressure. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the scent of stone and earth filling the small, dark space. Sunlight streamed in through a small window high up on the wall, casting a narrow beam of light across the floor. What do you think this place was? Esteban asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pablo stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Maybe a watchtower or a refuge? His voice trailed off as he noticed something in the corner, a small wooden chest covered in dust. Look at this! Esteban's eyes widened. Pablo, no, don't open that. Pablo ignored him, his fingers brushing over the worn surface of the chest. He could feel the history pulsing from it, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. Carefully he lifted the lid. Inside there was no treasure, no ancient relics, just a small, tattered book, its pages yellowed with age. Pablo picked it up gently, flipping it open. The handwriting inside was old, barely legible, but one word caught his eye. A name, Rosa. Pablo read aloud. Who do you think she was? Esteban, standing in the doorway, looked paler than ever. Let's not find out. Let's just go, Pablo, please. But Pablo was too intrigued to leave now. He skimmed through the book, his brow furrowing. It's a journal. This tower belonged to her. She wrote about hiding here, hiding from something. Esteban's eyes darted around the room as though expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. From what? Before Pablo could answer, a sound echoed from outside, a soft, distant melody, like someone humming a lullaby. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Did you hear that? Pablo whispered. Esteban's eyes were wide with fear. Yes, and we should leave now. Pablo froze, his ears straining to catch more of the eerie melody that seemed to drift through the air. The soft, haunting tune grew clearer, weaving its way through the thick stone walls of the tower. It was familiar, almost too familiar. Esteban's hand gripped Pablo's arm, his voice trembling. That can't be real. No one's out here but us. Pablo shook his head, his mind racing. Someone's out there. Someone has to be. Esteban's fear was palpable, but Pablo's curiosity had become something more, an obsession, a pull he couldn't shake. He tucked the old journal under his arm and stepped back toward the door. We have to find out where that music is coming from. You're insane, Esteban whispered, shaking his head, but he followed anyway, unwilling to leave Pablo's side despite the growing dread in his gut. As they stepped outside the tower, the sun was beginning to sink lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The melody still hung in the air, luring them deeper into the countryside. It wasn't coming from the path they'd taken, but from the direction of the distant hills, where the land grew more rugged and untamed. Whoever's playing that tune, it's not far, Pablo muttered, pushing his bike forward again. Or it's something worse, Esteban shot back, though his legs reluctantly followed, his bike wobbling under the strain of nerves. As they pedaled up the rough trail, the landscape grew wild. The neat rows of vineyards and olive groves faded into jagged rocks and dry, wind-swept hills. The air was thicker here, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something ancient. Suddenly the melody stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Pablo halted, his eyes scanning the barren hills, trying to locate the source of the song. But there was nothing, just the wind tugging at the scrub and dust around them. I knew it, Esteban gasped, his breath ragged from the climb. I knew we were chasing nothing. Pablo, still gripping the journal tightly, glanced around. But someone had to have been playing it. You heard it too, Esteban. Before either could speak again, they heard something new, a whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze. Pablo. Pablo's blood ran cold. It wasn't Esteban's voice. It was a woman's voice, quiet, calm, and unsettling. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes wide. Did you hear that? Esteban shook his head, backing away. No, I didn't hear anything. What are you talking about? It said my name, Pablo whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone's calling me. Before Esteban could respond, there was a rustling in the bushes ahead of them. The air seemed to thicken again, as if time had slowed. Pablo squinted, stepping forward cautiously. The rustling grew louder, and then, out from behind the scrub, a small, wide-eyed goat appeared, its eyes gleaming in the fading light. The tension broke as both Pablo and Esteban let out nervous laughs. "A goat," Esteban sighed in relief, wiping his brow. "I thought we were about to meet a ghost or something." Pablo chuckled, though his laughter was tinged with unease. "Maybe we're just chasing our shadows." But just as the goat bleated and trotted away, Pablo heard it again, clearer this time, a voice unmistakably female, calling softer from the hills. "Pablo!" He turned, scanning the horizon. There, silhouetted against the setting sun, stood a figure, too far away to make out clearly, but unmistakably watching them. Her shawl billowed in the wind. Esteban followed his gaze, his breath catching in his throat. "It's her, the woman from the road." Pablo's mouth went dry. "We have to go," he said, his voice a mixture of fear and urgency. Esteban didn't need convincing this time. "Let's get out of here," he agreed, already turning his bike around. As they pedaled down the hill, Pablo glanced back once more. The woman stood there, motionless, watching them. The wind carried her voice one last time. "Find Rosa." We hope you enjoyed this story. Do read it once more. If you liked it, please click the like button and consider subscribing to our channel. This way, we may reach people all over the world and help them grow their English language. We look forward to seeing you in our next lesson.